Hi there. Thank you so much for joining us tonight. My name is Amelia Holmes, and I am excited to introduce you to our speaker. Michael R. Harrison is a freelance historian and curator based in New York City, who also serves as the NHA's Obed Macy Research Chair. He has held curatorial positions at the National Building Museum, the Smithsonian's National Museum of American History, and the Glasgow Museum of Transport. He is the author of numerous books and articles, as well as nearly 70 historical reports on maritime, architecture, and engineering topics for U.S. National Park Service's heritage documentation programs. He is a graduate of the University of Pennsylvania and holds a master's degree in museum studies from the George Washington University. I'm going to turn it over now to Michael.
Hi, everybody. Thank you so much for joining us tonight. We're really happy to be able to bring you some new discoveries and some sort of old information that's been reshuffled in and looked at in new ways. And without further ado, we will switch from my fabulous home office to my slides. All right, so we're here to talk about connections to Chile, and by way of that, we're going to be talking about the Plaskett family, starting predominantly with this man. This is Joseph W. Plaskett, sea captain, and this particular really great portrait painted in China about 1804 by a famous Chinese artist known as Spoilum, who specialized in doing portraits of Western mariners. And we have a number of that artist's portraits in the collection of Nantucketers, and this is one of those, so really prized possession at the NHA. But I'm gonna walk us through a little bit of Nantucket connections to Chile in South America, and then you'll see why the Plaskett family comes up by way of that. And then after talking a bit about Plaskett's biography, which we've had a chance to look at anew recently, I'm going to walk through some of the artifacts that we have from this family in the NHA's collection and talk about his and his wife's sort of remarkable children and some of the other connections through the family. But this is our sea captain, and we will come back to him in a few moments. As soon as I get my slides to advance. There we go. So to set our scene, we're in South America. We want to be imagining that we're in the other hemisphere this evening. Chile, long, thin, mountainous country along the coast on the west side. As you can see here, these are, of course, the modern boundaries. These boundaries would not have been exactly the same when our story takes place, which is 1809, first decade of the 19th century. But this gives you a sense of sort of where we are. And when we talk about Nantucket connections to this country and to South America, the most obvious connection that comes up is Cape Horn. And so I've, in case you didn't know where Cape Horn was, I've put a little arrow and circled it way at the southern end of things. And Cape Horn is one of these interesting places in the world where it figures in the maritime stories of European countries, the United States, all kinds of places. But it is actually, of course, a geographic place that belongs to a single country. It belongs to Chile. And it's in a really interesting region of the world, which also, the significant Argentinian, influence nearby to the north, and really into British, the Falkland Islands that you can see there. So a really interesting part of the world that lots of the rest of the world visited or went past and figures very largely because, of course, in the 1790s, when British and American whalers start moving out of the Atlantic, the South Atlantic, into the Pacific, the South Pacific, they go this way. They have to go around Cape Horn in order to get to the new whaling grounds that they're discovering in the South Pacific along the coast of Chile. And so this is a very important spot for whalers, for international traders, and it's not a spot that any of them hoped to stop at, but it's definitely a spot that they hoped to survive passing. And then, going from there and very much in a way connected to Cape Horn, we have, you can't see it at the resolution on this map, but I've circled the general area, Masafuera. So Masafuera is one of a group of islands off the coast of Chile that are Chilean possessions. And these were islands that had substantial seal populations. And British and American ships would go there in order to capture seals and take the seal pelts. And then they would go to China and they would trade the pelts in China. Whaling ships would also stop at these islands to water and to gather fuel, possibly also to do some additional sealing if their whaling was not going so well. And so, here we are, we've gone around Cape Horn, we've come up the coast, there's all kinds of whaling and some sealing opportunities along the coast here. And then there's these really rich, or at the time, they were really rich, areas where seals lived, and Nantucketers were part of a big wave of Americans going to this area in the first decade of the 19th century. The island is now called Alejandro Selkirk Island. It was renamed in the 60s officially by the Chilean government. He was a 18th century mariner who was shipwrecked on Masafuera and is generally regarded to have been the inspiration for Robinson Crusoe. But in historic accounts and in many, many whaling logbooks, you'll see the whalers referring to stopping at Masafuera or sailing past Masafuera, spelled in a wide variety of different non-standard 19th century ways. But this is the Spanish spelling. And then I've circled here Valparaiso, significant port on the coast of Chile, not terribly far from Santiago, the capital, still a major international seaport, definitely the port of entry for Santiago. But this was certainly not the first place that your ship could call once you'd gone around Cape Horn, but it really was the first substantial port, where you might find banks and consulates and, Chilean government officials and all kinds of things. I mean, there are definitely ports further south and places to stop if your ship has encountered difficulties rounding the Horn. But really it's Valparaiso that becomes the international port of call after rounding Cape Horn. And not just for Nantucket whalers, but for international traders from Europe and the Americas all over. It was and is a very international place, substantial German and English and French and Danish, communities of expatriates there because of all of the trading. There are Nantucketers buried in the cemeteries there. When one talks about Nantucket connections to Chile, Valparaiso looms very, very large. We have records of Nantucket whaling captains who've gone on voyages into the Pacific, and they're on their way home and they stop at Valparaiso to do final provisioning before rounding the Horn on the way back. This was the last port of call for Captain Seth Pinkham, whose papers we have. He dies on the voyage home. This was his last port of call. The famous Essex disaster in 1820, the men in the boats way out in the Pacific working their way back, the 5 men who survived in the boats were picked up outside of Valparaiso, taken into Valparaiso, where the USS Constitution was, and that was the naval officer in charge of that, wrote the first report about all of this. So really, important sort of connection. But then down the coast here, we have another island. We have Isla Santa Maria, and the connection between this place and Nantucket, this is a new connection. This is not something that we knew about until a few months ago, when we were contacted by a colleague in Chile, in Santiago, an archeologist, who is working on, and it was affiliated with the Institute of Nautical and Underwater Archaeology. And this organization in Chile has been doing a lot of work sort of documenting shipwrecks. That's what they do. They look for shipwrecks, they look at shipwrecks, they study these things. And, they're interested in foreign shipwrecks in Chilean waters. And they found documentary evidence of a Nantucket vessel wrecked on St. Mary's Island, right here, down the coast from Valparaiso. And so they got in touch with us and they said, hey, we have found documentary evidence of this wreck. And the wreck was from Nantucket, and the captain was Joseph Plaskett. The ship was named Eliza. Do you know anything about Joseph Plaskett? And do you know anything about the Eliza? And one of the things that many underwater archaeologists, in looking, when they find documentary records of these kind of wrecks, they want to know, well, are there any technical specifics about the ship that we could, put on file in case somebody ever came across a wreck on this island? We might be able to actually identify that wreck is this ship, because we have the dimensions, or we have, some other technical details that could be lined up with the remains. And so the question was, what do you know about the ship Eliza of Nantucket, commanded by Joseph Plaskett? And that was, and I'm going to tell you about the wreck in just a second, but I want to just throw in that Joseph Plaskett and his family are well known to Nantucket historians, and they appear in many, many narratives from the island. But what I discovered is we didn't exactly have a really coherent single biography of him that really lined up his career. And this was the excuse for us to take that in hand and do that. And I'll give you his biography in a minute, but I want to go through a little bit of this sort of interesting wreck that we knew nothing about. We had no idea that a ship named Eliza had come to grief on this island in 1809, or any of the details about it. As far as we knew, Joseph Plaskett was in China at this time. The received wisdom on Nantucket was that Joseph Plaskett was the mate of the ship Rose on 3 voyages to China between 1800 and 1812. And it turns out that's not true. He was on 2 of those voyages and then was off doing his own thing later in order to be here in Chile. So this is one of the documents that our colleague in Chile made available to us. This is from the Chilean National Archives. And this is a copy from microfilm, but it's copying a book. And in the book is Captain Plaskett's actual handwritten note that's been, tipped into the book, that he left in the hands of his first mate. So what happens is that the Eliza, ship from Nantucket, is on a sealing voyage to this region. So they're going to pick up seal pelts. They're then going to sail to China. They're going to trade for tea and other Chinese goods. They're going to come back, probably to New York, sell the goods in New York, and then come back to Nantucket. And they come to St. Mary's to gather wood for fuel. And they drop anchor, and a gale comes up, and they drag their anchor, they part their anchor cable, and they are lodged onto the island and the sand, and the ship is wrecked. And they want to salvage as much as they can. They don't seem to have a whole lot of pelts yet, but they want to salvage stuff from the ship. They want to salvage the rigging of the ship, the blocks, empty casks, all this kind of stuff. And for some reason, it's not entirely clear. This all happens on the 1st of April, 1809. On the 3rd of April, Captain Plaskett sails away. He books passage on a British ship, the Rebecca, and he leaves. Probably because the Rebecca was headed the right direction and was leaving right away. And he took an opportunity rather than getting stuck, down, on the coast of Chile. But he leaves his first mate and members of his crew behind to salvage what they can and try and ship those things back to the United States if there's another ship that's going to be doing that. And so his letter here, which I've put this quote here, but I'll read a bit of it out loud for us. To any American captain or others, gentlemen, having been unfortunately wrecked on St. Mary on the 1st of this month while I was pursuing a sealing voyage to this place in the ship Eliza of Nantucket, and being bound away in an English ship that is full, I am forced to leave several things, he means such as, but he says as, standing rigging and some empty casks and all my spare cordage, which may possibly be found when the ship goes to pieces. And so he sails away. He leaves his first mate in charge, and the records continue. So this is the first page of the Spanish report. This amazing stuff. First page of the Spanish report saying what had happened, that the captain had left, that they were going to salvage the things. And then I didn't put all the pages here because I don't want to bore you all, but there's an exhaustive list of what the ship was carrying and what they salvaged. So they salvaged all the spars, all the rigging, all the men's clothes, all the tools, everything that they could move off this vessel. They took off the vessel. They didn't raise the ship. The ship eventually went to pieces, but they took everything else. They were not able to ship it home, it seems. The Spanish sold it off. But in this report is this list that you see on the right. And this is the crew. And it's the crew of the ship plus some local Spanish additional workers who helped out. And for those who do Nantucket history, you'll know that early crew lists are as good as gold. We don't have as many of them as we would like. And so to have a crew list from an early Nantucket sealing voyage is quite a rare thing. So this says Eduardo Hinckley at the top. Edward B. Hinckley was the mate. The next name, Jorge del Cameron, I'm not sure what the surname is there. He seems to be a Spanish other person, but Samuel Hull, Abram Sickle, Isaac Head, or maybe Heed, Thomas Bellamy. These are all seemingly people from Cape Cod. Interestingly, none of the crew seem to be from Nantucket. Bellamy is from Barnstable on the Cape. The other people I haven't been able to find specifically yet, but they do seem to be mostly New Englanders, not from Nantucket. And they, they're behind doing this work. Other reports say that the captain and additional members of the crew sailed together. This document says the captain by himself sailed away in the Rebecca. And he actually, the Rebecca takes him as far as St. Helena in the middle of the South Pacific, where he stops and he's able to board another ship, the Isis, that's on its way to Providence. And he gets home to Providence and then makes his way to Nantucket, and he arrives in Providence in September of 1809. So this is all happening in early April. It's not till September that he arrives home, and probably is the first person bringing any news of this to people on Nantucket, to the investors in the voyage, to the insurance underwriters, anybody else who's involved with this. So as I said, this wreck, totally unknown to us, didn't know that Joseph Plaskett had been here at this date involved with this vessel. Now we don't know what the ship Eliza actually looked like. So this is another drawing in our collection. This is the ship Lady Adams of Nantucket, which also made voyages to China and to Europe. It's about the right size, certainly the right rig, probably painted very similarly to what we think the Eliza might have looked at. But as you remember, I said, our colleagues in Chile asked us, what do you know about the ship Eliza of Nantucket? Well, let me tell you, it is really difficult to pin down a single vessel called Eliza at the beginning of the 19th century. People loved to name their ships after their family members. There are many, many ships named Eliza in New England at this time. There are 3, 4, maybe even 5 Elizas that are sailing from Nantucket in 1809. One of them we know is commanded by Captain Hussey. We don't know which Hussey, but it's making regular trading voyages to Europe in this period. There's 1 or 2 Elizas going to Patagonia and Brazil in this period, one of which might be the one that wrecked at St. Mary's, we're not sure. There's a really nice record of a ship Eliza of Nantucket that does make a sealing voyage to the South Seas under a Captain Bunker between 1802 and 1804. It's possible that that is the same vessel that we're talking about under a different captain on a previous voyage. There's another Eliza that we know that arrives in New York with a cargo from China under a Captain Chase in May of 1808. Again, these all might be the same ship. The one that's heading to Europe is definitely a different ship, but all these ones going to China and to Patagonia, we're not sure if it's one ship or multiple ships. Confusing matters even further, the very first American vessel that goes to the island of Masafuera, which I showed you earlier, to hunt seals, was named Eliza. But it was the Eliza of New York under a Captain Palmer, and then a succession of other captains, because the captains kept dying on the voyage, unfortunately. That's a whole nother story. But that's definitely not our ship at all. That ship wrecked in 1794. So anyway, unfortunately, we haven't been able to discover as much about the technical specifics of the Eliza of Nantucket as we'd like, but we now have a very complete description of her entire rig and all of her stores and everything else and who was in her crew and what happened to her. And it has led us to reevaluate the biography of Joseph Plaskett. So here we are again, Joseph Plaskett. And again, with our great portrait by the Chinese artist Spoilum. Joseph, we've known about this person. We have lots of artifacts. I'll show you some of these artifacts. We didn't have like a birth. Did we have the birth date? We didn't know where he was. Like we couldn't find certain birth records for him, and various things were missing. And so this was really an excuse for us to like piece it together. And it turns out he wasn't born on Nantucket. He was from, sorry, his family, they were from Plymouth. And he was born there. His father was also named Joseph. You know, and he ended up, his early seafaring career is a little opaque. So we're not sure when he first sails on voyages, either from Plymouth or from Boston perhaps, or from Nantucket. But he shows up in the historical record first in 1799. And he's the second mate on the very first voyage from Nantucket that goes to China. That's the ship Mars, and it's commanded by Uriah Swain, and the first mate is a man named James Carey, a name that will resonate with many other students of Nantucket history. So Uriah Swain, James Carey, and Joseph Plaskett are the captain and the two mates on the Mars going to China, first trading voyage from Nantucket to there. And they come back in 1802, so a 3-year voyage. And then in 1803, James Carey, the second mate on the voyage of the Mars, he's given command of the ship Rose. And Plaskett, who you see here on the screen, becomes his first mate. And they sail off to China in 1803. And then in most tellings, Carey is in command, Plaskett is the second mate, on 3 voyages to China between 1803 and 1812. And this wreck of the Eliza at Isle of St. Mary forced us to reevaluate that. Because clearly Joseph Plaskett, in that period, ends up in Chile on a shipwreck. And what has happened is that he's the first mate on the Rose on 2 voyages out of those 3. And on the 3rd voyage, he goes and does something else. He's on the Eliza. And to double check this, I did a lot of searching in 19th century newspaper shipping reports. And then I looked at his children. So he and his wife, Persis, and I'll talk about Persis a little later, they have 8 children. And if you look at when the children are born, they, of course, are born in relation to when he's at home in the midst of all of these international trading voyages. And of course, it's entirely possible that his wife could have had a child that didn't line up with when he was at home, but giving them the benefit of the doubt, he definitely cannot be in China on the 3rd voyage of the Rose that ends in 1812, because he and his wife have a child, and there's just simply no way that that child could have been born when the child was born if he was away on the Rose. And the birth of the child works out perfectly well if he goes when he's going and doing this voyage to Chile. So I hope you're all following this. You know, it is a way to sort of figure out whether people are at sea or not to see when their children are born with Nantucket whaling and sealing vessels and voyages. The other thing is that the final voyage of the ship Rose from Nantucket, commanded by James Carey became ill at Canton and was ill for months and months. The ship waited there for him to recover for months and months. And then he died, and the first mate brought the ship home. And in most tellings of the story, the first mate would then be Joseph Plaskett bringing the ship home. But all of the references to the vessel is subsequently captured by the British on its way home, and Plaskett is nowhere ever mentioned. He's clearly not aboard that ship. And we know he's not aboard the ship now because he's commanding the Eliza that comes to grief off of Chile. So a chance to sort of reassess some of what we've always thought we knew about some of these Nantucket China voyages. I did want to show a few things that we have. This is a Japanese teapot or coffee pot, part of a set of coffee and tea wares, that Plaskett bought abroad for his wife on one of the voyages that he made. Now, we don't have any direct evidence that he called in Japan, and calling in Japan would have been extremely unusual at this time, but, and maybe somebody in the audience will tell me, no, that's Chinese, not Japanese. We've always had this cataloged as if it were Japanese, so there may be something amiss with that. Nevertheless, this descended in the family with a set of matching dishes and cups, and he gave it to his wife, having brought it from overseas. And then these, many people who've been to the Nantucket Whaling Museum will recognize these guardian lion candlesticks. This pair of candlesticks, actually Captain James Carey of the Rose bought these for his wife, Betsy, on one of the voyages. But Plaskett bought an identical set for his wife, Persis, probably at the same time. We don't know exactly, but we know that he bought an identical set and gave them to his wife. His wife, unfortunately, as the story goes, broke them. Now, they had many children, so one can always imagine that Persis herself may not have broken them, but somehow they came to be broken. And Betsy Carey sold Persis Plaskett her pair of the same candlesticks, and that's these. So these have come down to us through the Plaskett family, but you can't quite see, but if you look at the white chimney parts of these candlesticks, there's a monogram in gold on each one, and those are the initials of James and Betsy Carey. So really nice sort of family connection between the captain and his mate and their wives, making deals with these fantastical souvenirs from abroad. So in looking up, trying to get Plaskett's career, Joseph Plaskett's career, to sort of line up with being in Chile in 1809, I was able to do a lot of new research on his seafaring career. And here are two references from various Boston newspapers to him commanding various coastal vessels during the period around when he does the voyage to Chile. So in the first, he's commanding the sloop Hunter, and it goes to Guadeloupe. That's what Bassetera G is. That's Guadeloupe. And I want to throw in that while Nantucket is super famous for whaling and somewhat less famous for sealing voyages, coastal trading voyages were a very, very big deal and were a substantial key part of life on Nantucket. And although the vessels were much, much smaller than the whaling vessels, they were no less important to the economy of the island. And sloops and schooners and brigs connected the island to seaports throughout the East Coast, to the West Indies, to South America, sometimes to Europe. There were dozens and dozens of them, and the people who worked on the whaling vessels then sometimes commanded those and back and forth, and it's all interconnected as a maritime economy. And so I'm not at all surprised to see Plaskett commanding these schooners and sloops rather than big ships from time to time. I also want to make a quick point. You'll see in both of these that his name is spelled only with one T at the end. In later slides, you're going to see his name is often spelled with two T's at the end. His family seems to have decided, his children's generation seems to have decided that the family name should be spelled with two T's. His generation had no such qualms about one T or two. All of his signatures seem to do one, so I have stuck to one. The newspapers tend to stick to one, but his children do it with two. Cautionary tale, if you're ever looking in historic sources for these names, try and do wildcard searches because you'll miss things if you assume the spelling is standard. Anywho, without getting diverted, this bottom news report is actually quite interesting. So during the War of 1812, a substantial number of American sailors were held prisoner at Halifax, as well as other places. And there were worked out prisoner exchange opportunities during the course of the war. And neutral vessels could sail to Halifax and pick up and do prisoner exchanges. And so these were known as Cartel Voyages, and Plaskett commanded one of these. Took the Franklin. This says Swedish schooner. Swedish, I think in this case, is operating as a flag of convenience, meaning that it was neutral, was definitely not a Swedish schooner. But he sails to Halifax to pick up Nantucketers and others who are prisoners of war there. They accidentally strike the Point Pleasant shoals at the entrance to Halifax Harbor. The ship is wrecked, and he immediately procures a different ship hires a different ship and sails back to Nantucket. Fantastically complicated story that appears is misreported in various newspapers and things, but he's involved with that. And who knew that Nantucket vessels were involved in this kind of prisoner exchange directly during the course of the war. but pretty interesting. And then just to summarize the rest of his career a little quickly, he eventually purchases, after surviving the War of 1812 and surviving the thing in Chile, he purchases a schooner, the Emmeline, that he runs in coastal voyages from Nantucket all up and down the East Coast. This is a voyage to New Orleans at the top, but he's also goes to Boston, goes to New York, sometimes goes across the Atlantic, carrying general cargoes. And then in 1824, he sells the Emmeline and he takes possession of a brand new brig, the Sophia and Eliza, and he commands that until his death at the age of 51, 3 years later. But this vessel is built for him. You know, the shipbuilder is also an investor in the ship, but it really is his. And you know, he's sort of like given up whaling and sealing, but you know, is making a living as a sea captain, carrying general cargoes up and down the Atlantic coast, you know, to support his family. So a really kind of diverse career, you know, that touches on many sort of threads. He doesn't seem to go whaling, but it's possible he went whaling in his youth, and we just don't have records of that. But very much tied to these sealing voyages to Chile, voyages to China, and then all of this coastal voyaging, which is a sort of untapped, needs to be explored part of Nantucket history. He's very, very involved in that. But then one of the things that I think is particularly interesting here, and I hope you'll all forgive me for using Chile as my sort of launching off point and our excitement about discovering this new shipwreck we knew nothing about, and using it as a way to then talk about a single family and their involvement. But, you know, it is really kind of remarkable how much information the NHA has about this family and all of their connections to seafaring on Nantucket. And so I do want to take everybody on a sort of tour of the next generation. And so please bear with me while I do that. In addition to the brilliant Chinese portrait of Plaskett, we have these two cut silhouettes that descended in the family. And of course, that, as you can see on screen, Joseph Plaskett on the left and his wife Persis Plaskett on the right. Her name, often spelled P-E-R-S-I-S, in period records seems to also be spelled P-E-R-S-E-S, which also appears on her tombstone. She is the daughter of a woman named Susan Colesworthy, who comes from Boston, part of a Boston family. And many of you who've been to the NHA will have seen this artifact. This is a hand-stitched embroidery from 1765, part of a group of embroideries that survive, all from the same sort of school of embroidery, the same teacher teaching young ladies how to do this, based on a similar picture. And Susan Colesworthy, Joseph Plaskett's wife's mother, stitched this when she was a teenager, and then it descended in the family. Now, Susan Colesworthy, who did this, she seems to have had her daughter Persis out of wedlock. If not exactly out of wedlock, then her husband abandoned her right away. So Persis, here we have Persis again. Persis is usually said to have been, her maiden name is said to have been Persis Colesworthy, because her mother's name was Susan Colesworthy. But in some records, her birth name, her maiden name is Persis Percy. And it seems that her father was a man whose surname was Percy, and his first name has not survived. And they never married. She was born out of wedlock. And Susan came to Nantucket, I believe to stay with relatives, although knowledgeable people in the audience will correct me on that. And so Persis, although her mother was from Boston, she was raised on Nantucket, and ended up marrying Joseph Plaskett in 1798. So before he's making any of these voyages to China, they get married, and they have 8 children. One child dies in childhood, and we know very little about him except his name, Phillips. But then all of their other children are linked to maritime stuff on Nantucket in one way or another. So, oh, I forgot to take him out. Sorry, that's a distant relation I don't want to talk about. So this is their oldest child, William Plaskett, who goes on to become a whaling captain. He commands 11 whaling voyages from Nantucket between 1818 and 1845, which is basically, so he's gone whaling as a teenager and worked his way up. He gets his first command at the age of 20, and then his commanding voyages until the age of 47 when he retires. So away from home a lot. His wife is Nancy Pollard. So she is a sister of George Pollard Jr., who was the captain of the whale ship Essex. So Nantucketers often are related to each other. It's a small island. There's, family connections abound everywhere. And this is, wife of one whaling captain, sister of a whaling captain marries another whaling captain and the son of a captain. So very interesting. They obviously, they met with success. He met with success. They were able to pay for these quite sort of flashy portraits in the 1830s, which make him look quite dashing and her look quite fashionable. So that's the eldest son and his wife. Now William Plaskett, commands a Nantucket vessel called the Napoleon. And on one of the voyages of the Napoleon, they stop at St. Helena, where it was famous for where Napoleon Bonaparte was imprisoned at the end of his life. And it was a thing for vessels in the Atlantic to stop at St. Helena to reprovision and then to visit the sites. Who else would visit there except sailors? And there was a tree at his grave. People would take cuttings from the tree. They'd take dead wood from the tree. There are boxes and all kinds of souvenirs throughout the world made from the wood of this willow tree. And on Nantucket, William Plaskett brought a cutting back, planted the tree, and the tree grew on Nantucket until it died. And then all its wood was made into baskets and, not baskets, but, dishes and things and souvenirs. So this sign is actually in the NHA collection related to the family. So then the next child, and again, I hope you all bear with me. I'm finding this endlessly fascinating. I hope you all will as well. Their Joseph and Persis' second child was a daughter named Susan, and we don't have a picture of her, but we do have a picture of her daughter, who was also named Susan, and that's the younger Susan here. And she marries George Brock, another sailor. George Brock is best known for commanding clipper ships out of Boston on voyages to San Francisco, freighting voyages, 10 years worth of freighting voyages around Cape Horn. On at least one of these voyages, Susan, his wife, and Susan, his daughter, go with him. This is the Midnight, the ship he commands, which also goes to China at various times. He takes them along. This little girl goes on this whaling voyage with her mother. There's a famous story of Captain Plaskett going and waking his daughter and bringing her up on deck while they were at sea and pointing out Cape Horn and saying, how few girls get to see Cape Horn, but there it was. Susan Plaskett, the younger one, who's pictured here, she goes on to become the first curator of the Nantucket Historical Association. And she is also the sort of caretaker of her family's history. And many of the objects that we have, not all, but many of the objects we have from Joseph Plaskett and Persis Plaskett, Susan Colesworthy, and all the people I'm talking about came from her because they descended to her, and then she bequeathed them. She either gave them during her life, she gave a few things to NHA during her life, but then when she died, she gave most of her family collection to the NHA. So really interesting NHA connections through this. Continuing on, this again is the second generation below our hero, Joseph Plaskett, his wife Persis. This is their children. They have another daughter named Mary. This is not a silhouette of Mary. This is just a silhouette I picked to represent a woman because I didn't want her to be anonymous, but she kind of is. We don't know what she looked like, but she married another whaling captain, Edward Coffin. And here is Edward Coffin later in life in a somewhat battered, shall we say, portrait. So again, more whaling connections. Then we have Eliza, the third daughter. Eliza marries more than once. Her first marriage is to Timothy Clapp, who's a bookseller on Nantucket. Let me find my little notes here. Taylor and a bookseller, and they marry. And this is a set of really lovely, these are unfortunately not the best pictures of them, but really lovely little miniature portraits of the two of them, done, we think, close to the time of their marriage. Her with a nice heart locket, gift from him. really nice things. But we also have, these are the same people, these portraits of them when they're a little bit older. I didn't mean to do the contrast of facing and not facing, don't read into that. But really interesting, nice portraits. Again, she's coming across as very stylish, and he's coming across as a little bit severe maybe, but sort of successful bookseller. He does pass away before she does, and she remarries David Mitchell. And she actually, although David Mitchell is her second husband, she is his fourth wife. So some of the things on Nantucket that sometimes happen with remarriages. Eliza Plaskett Clapp here was also very much into family history and keeping her family's legacy. And a very early collection of the NHAs is her reminiscences that were collected specifically. And she was quite celebrated for her memory and for her interest in family history, much like her niece. And then this is a cap that she knitted for the birth of her first son, Joseph, named after his grandfather. We have a number of these in the collection, really nice handmade pieces from Eliza Clapp. Moving right along, we have a son named after the father, Joseph N. Plaskett, also a whaling captain. He commands 3 whaling voyages, probably went on many others, may have commanded some freighting voyages. He died single, he did not marry. He died in the course of one of his voyages. He fell ill and died, and the ship went on and finished its voyage and came home. So a bit of a tragic side to his story. And then Henry R., the youngest son, another whaling captain. You're going to sense a theme here. The father goes on sealing voyages and freights all up and down the East Coast. All of his sons go whaling. And we just happen to have 2 really nice photographic portraits of him. You can try and guess which one is earlier. My guess is the one on the left is a little earlier, and the one on the right is a little bit later, but it could have been the other way around. These are all late 1850s, early 1860s. He marries, I mentioned earlier, a captain named Seth Pinkham, who, his last port of call was Valparaiso, and he died on his way home on a whaling voyage. This man, Henry Plaskett, married Seth Pinkham's daughter, Mary Pinkham. And it's through Mary Pinkham that many other items have come to Nantucket from this family, including in a very roundabout way, the fantastic Chinese portrait of Joseph Plaskett that we started with. That belonged to this man's descendants, went to a college, Whitman College. Whitman College gave it to the NHA. Other family items are still at Whitman College, including a portrait of Susan Colesworthy's mother and all kinds of things that we would love to borrow or have transferred to us someday. But connections here. What I guess the overarching point I want to make is that when you start looking at these Nantucket families and bringing together sort of a cohesive picture of like the father of the family has this whole career and it's really interesting, and he marries this interesting woman, and they have all these children, and the children have all these adventures, and then they're all married to these other families that the NHA has also told stories about. We did a whole exhibition on the Pinkham family a few years ago. We have talked about George Pollard and the Essex all the time, very famous Nantucket story. These people are all connected. And even if they weren't literally intermarried, which is the case here, they all know each other. They're all part of the same community. They're all trying to make a living out of seafaring and whaling, these very sort of difficult, risky things, risky economically, risky physically. They're going off to the far side of the world routinely from this tiny little parochial island. It's really interesting stuff, so to find that our hero of this story, Joseph W. Plaskett, the father, is part of a shipwreck in Chile in 1809 that we had never heard of. On the one hand, that's a surprise. On the other hand, it's not a surprise because they're all over the place. They're all going to places. Poor Henry's brother dies in the Cape Verde Islands, and his other brother, William, happens to be at Napoleon's grave and picks up a cutting, and they're all able to do these things. And that's such an interesting thing about Nantucket. These connections and this sort of connection, the small local crucible kind of place off the Cape Cod coast connected to the entire world. And just for a bit of fun, this is a piece in our scrimshaw collection at the NHA. This is a telescoping hat rack or coat rack. All of the cross pieces are made out of whale pan bone, and all the hooks are made out of small sperm whale teeth. And the thing obviously accordions up and down to fit. You know, you could store the thing, or you know, make it up, put it on a smaller wall. This was made by Henry Clapp, who's one of the sons of Eliza Plaskett Clapp, who we saw a few slides ago. And then I should mention, there is a final daughter, Charlotte Plaskett Kelly. She marries Captain Randall Kelly, another whaling captain. And we have this somewhat damaged, but I must say very evocative daguerreotype of her, but no pictures of her husband. So to round us out, this is Joseph Plaskett's tombstone. He is buried on island. He's in New North Cemetery, which is in my notes here. Some guess he's married in New North Cemetery. His wife Persis has a stone next to it. You know, sacred to the memory of Captain Joseph W. Plaskett, died in 1827, 51st year of his age. And we have this nice, the symbolism of the willow tree and the urn over that. But I think that, you know, to wrap it up, the main point I wanted to make by going on this excursion through this one family really is this idea of connectedness, and the idea that people from this small island, which has lots of interesting, unique island stories, is also like international, and they're out there. And, you know, by discovering, thanks to colleagues, you know, this was entirely a discovery brought to our attention by other people doing other research, you know, of a wreck we'd never heard of involving a famous Nantucket captain. We never would have known that he had been there, nor would we know who his crew was and what happened to them. So I'm happy to have been able to take you on this journey today, look at some of the connections with Chile, known and more surprising, and then to give you a better sense of the Plaskett family. If you want to know more about any of the objects we have from the family, you can look on our website, nha.org. We have a complete Collections Explorer, collections database. You can search for Plaskett, and you'll find spoons and blankets and china and portraits and all kinds of things from this family. And you can also find, we have linked there in the record for the portrait of Captain Plaskett, a summary of his biography that you can all read. So with that, I'm done. We're happy to take questions if anybody has any. And I will stop sharing. There we go.
Hi, Michael. That was really great. I'm glad we went on that journey with you. So I do want to open it up for questions, and we've had a few come in already. So these are related more generally to whaling. And so can you just tell us, was it common for children to be born while the husband was at sea? And are there any interesting tales of something like that happening that you'd like to share?
It is common for children to be buried at sea. Sorry, that does happen too. It is common for children to be born after their fathers have departed. The length of time that, like somebody who was an officer or a boat steerer working their way up through the ranks might not be on land very long. They might be on land for 3 months. They might be on land for 9 months. It varied, depended on what their circumstances were, how desperately they needed more money, what ships were sailing. They wanted specifically to go with this ship owned by this person. It wasn't ready yet. They're going to wait. So many families where the fathers sail away, their children line up with those gaps of when they're at home. And sometimes the children will be born while the father is still there because the father is there for a year. And other times the father sails away after 3 months, the child is born 6 months later. That happens all the time. There definitely are instances where children are born and the father's been gone the wrong number of months. One example, and it's not quite in line with what I think the person is asking about, but Samson Dyer was African-American, part Wampanoag man who was supercargo on at least one voyage to China. And then he goes off on voyages to South America. And at least one of our audience members will, of course, correct me if I get any of these details wrong on this. I apologize if I do. He's away long enough that his wife I believe, thinks he's gone. And she either remarries or she takes up with someone else, and she does have other children. And when he returns home, he discovers that she has another family. And that causes friction between them, and they split, and he moves away permanently. And there is drama like that. There probably are other instances of this as well. But in many of the cases that I've seen, fidelity seems to be more the rule than the exception. Probably due to really extreme community pressure, particularly in the Quaker community. But in my very story here, we have, Joseph W. Plaskett's wife is born out of wedlock. And so something has happened with her mother that we don't know the full story of, but there is an example of something that's sort of out of the bounds of what's normal, whether it involved a sailor going away or coming back.
Yeah, but what's really cool is that even though we don't know now, there's still like a possible future where we may find out.
That's right.
We just have to stay tuned. So can you tell us more about what happened to, this is like kind of out of left field, but I know you'll know the answer. So can you tell us a little bit more about what happened to American ships, particularly Nantucket whaling ships and their crewmen that were captured during the War of 1812?
So the crew were often taken captive, or they were impressed into the British Navy. It depended on a lot of factors. It depended on, were those crewmen, could they prove they were Nantucketers? Were those crewmen English expatriates who said they were American, but the British didn't believe them? There's a variety of different circumstances there. Lots and lots of them were taken prisoner and were held in prisons, either in Britain. There were prisons that the British, honestly, that was the Revolution. There's various ways and places that they are taken prisoner. Halifax is one of these places. The ships tended to be taken back to Britain or taken to Canada. And they would be condemned at a prize court and sold off, and the value of their fittings and the ship and any cargo would be divided up in a certain percentage among the capturing British vessel. So they were gone. Particularly speedy American vessels that were captured would sometimes be bought into the British Navy for reuse by the British Navy. Don't know of any American vessel, or sorry, any Nantucket vessels specifically that were purchased into the British Navy, but it is a conceivable possibility.
Cool. Well, thank you. So this one kind of is more related to our topic tonight. And so the Napoleon willow tree that you mentioned coming back here to Nantucket, was that on Center Street? And was there also one on Easy Street that was like related to the Plaskett tree?
I'm not going to know the details of this accurately enough to stake my reputation on. I'm thinking that in my head, the first one is on Orange Street, and I may have that wrong, and it is probably the one on Center Street that you're thinking of. And I don't know, and there's probably an entire history of this I've just never researched, of taking cuttings from that and putting them somewhere else or bringing back additional pieces. So I don't know of a tree on Easy Street specifically, but I wouldn't be surprised. We definitely have in our collection, in addition to that sign that the town put up saying, this is the tree that Plaskett brought back, we have carved bowls and other kinds of souvenir items made from limbs of that tree, either when they fell during storms or when the tree itself died. So I'm not gonna say exactly whether it was on Center Street or Orange Street, because what's lodged in my head might not be right. But yeah, that whatever one you're thinking of is probably the one I'm referring to.
Cool. So kind of feeding into this, how many hours of research, right, like did this take? Because I feel like that's really, you're just kind of you've responded to this question that came in, but then you've also now kind of fleshed it out and just how long does this take? Like, what's your process like?
Is my boss watching, and should I give this away? This takes a lot of effort. And I don't know the exact number of hours, all told, this might be a week's worth of time to figure all this out. We were asked specifically, what do you know about a ship named Eliza, as technical as possible? What do you know about a man named Plaskett? And what I discovered was we knew a lot. We knew that a man named Plaskett existed, and we didn't have a straight line biography of him that made sense. And then we had no idea about a ship named Eliza. So piecing the Eliza together, that was a lot of time looking at records, lining up names, lining up voyages, and putting the dots together and seeing the pattern emerge. And then making inferences and saying, we know this, we don't know this, so on. And then Plaskett, there is a lot of received wisdom about him because he's well known for having been on these voyages of the Rose to China. And those were researched at a time when certain records were available and new records weren't available. And there was reason to like poke holes in that and get that all put together. Some of the more sketchy things that I said about his family, I did all of that. I did that this week, to make this presentation, flesh out a bit more. There is a lot more that could be said. There's more generations, there's more seafaring connections. There's whole biographies that could be written of all of the children. And that could be, a week each. But so to answer the basic question, it takes a lot of time and takes a lot of care to do this. We have enough Plaskett family artifacts and portraits and photographs to make devoting this kind of time worth it. And to help our colleague, in South America understand sort of who this person was and what they were dealing with. But this means that when you go to our website and you look up and you find, Joseph Plaskett's mother, Tabitha, we have a spoon from her and we have a blanket from her, and now we know they're from her and who she was. And previously we didn't have that connection made in our records, and now it's linked all directly, and it makes all these things more usable for us in terms of exhibition and publication. So it's worth devoting the time every once in a while to one story in depth because it branches out to lots and lots of places in the organization.
Yeah, well, and that's what I really love personally about your presentation tonight is how it really does show that I think sometimes people can just assume that a museum or a historical association, that we just like are kind of a definitive source of information, but we don't always know everything. We don't know everything. And there's always just like room for learning and for growing. And I really do appreciate, as the person monitoring the reference queries that come in and giving you this one, that there's always, sometimes the questions are really rote and we know the answers. It's just, yes, we're open this time. Yes, there were many coffins. You are correct. Just can be very straightforward. But then there's other times where someone asks you something and you're just like, oh, like we don't know. And we kind of work together to just find that response. And so that's how, we got this presentation tonight. So anyway, thank you. And I think I'm just checking here about these last few questions. So the last question just is, was the letter and crew record that you shared from Chile, was that found after looking up records following the discovery of the shipwreck, or was that something you knew about before?
So in this case, the researcher, the archaeologist in Chile, who we've been corresponding with, they're working on their own projects. And they've been doing exhaustive searching in the Chilean National Archives in certain record groups for records related to ships that wrecked. And they found in the records those documents that I showed. They haven't found the actual wreck. They might in future find that wreck, or if they're ever doing work at that island, they now have a data point saying if we find a wreck, well, we know at least one documented wreck that was there. That's part of why they want to know technical specifics about the Eliza. If you find pieces of a ship, how far apart are the timbers? Is that match the ship? Whatever. Anyway, they were starting from the records. They found this in the records. And someday might, we hope, go looking for the wreck. But it was from that and trying to create, get a better sense of like, oh, we've never heard of this. There's a document about it. Maybe the people in Nantucket can help us. That's sort of how that came. And I asked them specifically, oh my word, could you please send me all the documents that you found? Because we would love to have records of them. We'd love to read them. We have relatively few, we know what a typical ship was equipped with at this period. But to have an actual list of this vessel from Nantucket was literally carrying these kinds of things in its cordage and this many spars tells us things about the kind of vessels they thought were appropriate, the kind of rig they thought was appropriate, the kind of equipment they thought they needed for a sealing voyage. That's like gold for us. And then to know who's in the crew, it's one thing to celebrate great sea captains. It's another thing to recognize the really hard work of a team of people who are often anonymous, and to have those names is just super key for us. And there's this whole thing about, Chile becoming an independent nation later on, and so on and so on. Further correspondence with this archaeologist has turned up that the NHA has a logbook from a really kind of important early Chilean voyage after Chilean independence to carry settlers to the south to help claim land. And they hired an American ship to do this, and we have the logbook from that voyage. And so we've provided that back to him. So long-winded answer, but they started at the records instead of at the shipwreck.
Yeah, no, thanks for going into that, and just that there's, the cycle of research continues, more to come.
Yes.
So thank you so much for your time tonight, Michael. We've really enjoyed it, and I just want to thank our attendees tonight for spending part of their evening with us as well. Media sponsorship for this evening's event is, as always, generously provided by Novation Media, and please join us next about the War of 1812 in more depth and Nantucket's connection to it with Captain Don Peacock. Programs such as this one are made possible thanks to the support of our members. So if you are not a member, please do consider joining by heading to nha.org/membership. Thank you so much and have a great night.
Thank you.